Framing is an essential part of understanding or seeing anything. The frame that we look through affects almost everything that we value and perceive because we look at something through a frame. It's often called a paradigm, and it's built on usually the best mental technology that we have available to us. No frame is fully correct or comprehensive, but statistically, using one frame versus another in a given scenario will produce statistically better results in terms of sustainable human well-being. The frame of my culture is discretion, confidentiality, a very patronizing and chauvinistic attitude towards intense emotions, towards anything feminine, which includes the inner world relative to the outer. The subjective world in chauvinism is diminished. The objective world is elevated rather than forming a complete balanced symmetry. In the frame that I'm using, the core of the tree, represented by the inner child, the adolescent, in the psyche, is the fountain or the template out of which the larger self, the young adult, the adult, or at least the grown-up, emerges. And in the mathematics of the psyche, the best symmetry, the best return on investment occurs when the strong, and I'm talking about the empathic or transcendent regions of the brain, when the strong protect the weak, when the old protect the infants, the young, when the adult self advocates for the youngest, the smallest, the most wounded, and the most vulnerable faces of the psyche, when the king advocates for the peasants, when the president advocates for the citizens, we see a coming together of the equation of trust, the equation of leadership, the equation that says basically in any construct of power or hierarchy that the many will lend their influence to the one, the leader, the king, the adult. The many will lend their influence and their energy to the one, and the one will serve the many. The law of empathy dictates that in any leadership role where you want a nonviolent society, the figurehead, the leader, must dictate the priority of resources, the priority of energy, to those parts within the self, to those parts within the community, to those parts within the country, the species, the ecology, that are exposed to the most pain, and must use that leadership authority to bolster those that are most vulnerable, those that are most weak, and in doing so, secure and maintain the trust of the ethical contract with leadership. That contract is being violated as a species in relationship to our environment, as a president in a relationship to the citizenry, as the military or the intelligence communities in regard to the citizenry, as church leaders. 5% are estimated to be pedophiles in relationship to the most innocent in their community, as parents relate to their children. using them for emotional needs, for sexual needs, etc., rather than being in service. And this is a function of a culture of grown-up children, grown-up wounded children who have not found adult leadership in parents and school and government, in culture, have often not matured to a point of understanding the responsibility of a big one for a small one. Carrying this into the inner psyche, the focus is logically on the smallest, most hurt and wounded parts of our psyche, which is a microcosm of the most wounded and hurt parts in the culture. The advocacy must be for the smallest and most wounded part. And the role that I'm choosing to take in response to that awareness, which is a mathematical probability field. If you want to study a sustainable nonviolent culture, these are the protocols, these are the geometries that lead to sustainable culture. In order to speak on behalf of a wound that is being systematically minimized, denied, silenced, avoided, and shamed, one must enter the wounded part of the psyche and give it voice. You will be a healthier human being if you get in touch with the most fragile wounds in childhood and advocate strongly for change within the cult that produced those wounds, within the community that allowed those wounds. And that's really what this is about. So I can talk here about meta theory, etc., but within these pages, my loyalty is to the wound. It is not my wound. It is our wound. And in a cult of denial, in a cult of ignorance, in a cult of shame, the wound tends to be shunted into scapegoats. And so in this role, I'm also targeted as a scapegoat within the community that sits passively by. It is healthy to be outraged at violations of power, violation of trust, and abuse. It is not healthy to be passive, to be ignorant, to chauvinistically stand by as the most feminine parts of the psyche are systematically demeaned in both men and women in a chauvinistic cult. I give this context to help reframe the anger and also the violation of conventions. Chauvinism says that as part of diminishing the feminine wound, it is not worth more than a few minutes of time. I say it's worth a good 1,000 hours. Chauvinism says it's not worth educating the cult on trauma, on abuses, on incest, on rape. Sigmund Freud, when he wrote his most seminal paper about the systematic abuses of young girls and women in Vienna, was universally shunned and ostracized by the elite of his day, and he did not gain recognition until he pivoted away, abandoning both the inner child and betraying the women who had given him their trust, showing hostility and contempt, and thus mirroring the chauvinistic wound of the cult. Thus we have a paramount or the primary paradigm of our culture is about the deviance in boys and girls in their lustful fantasies, as opposed to a condemnation of the fact that in some of our most recent studies, which mirrored Freud's analysis, 1 in 3 women and girls are sexually abused before the age of 18 and have a horrific time in our courts. So this is the frame in which, in order to honor the wound at that depth and at the change necessary to revolutionize the chauvinistic paradigm towards something more balanced, which obviously in geometry leads to grace, leads to intelligence. You don't want a half wheel as your transportation device. You want a full wheel if you don't want a very violent ride. You do not want a half brain. You want a full brain. You do not want grown-ups stuck in the chauvinistic mental abstractions and unable to feel. You want people who can grieve. You want people who can feel intensely. And so with that, I introduce the wound.